I will not be issuing a challenge to Bill Hayden.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory.
You feel a little embarrassed tonight at the blood that's on your hands.
The election will be on the 5th of March.
It really surprises me that some people in this party think we owe Westpac something, or the ANZ Bank, or the National.
I tell you what, any boss who sacks anyone for not turning up today is a bum.
December 20th, 1991. Paul Keating, Prime Minister at last, takes possession of the office he has always coveted. He gives Labor's most successful ever leader a day's notice to quit.
A lot of people believed I was weak in not asserting authority more often over Keating.
One of the greatest partnerships in Australia's political history ended as destiny demanded. Secret agreements broken, power brutally snatched.
I'd been happy to work with Bob and had a lot of engaging and, in times, thrilling times with him. And we'd done a lot together as a pair. But I'd taken, in my view, too many of his responsibilities over too early in the piece. And by 1991, I'd had the better part of a large part of what I thought were the prerogatives of the leader for 7 years. It was too long a thing. It went on for too long. And it was becoming a joke.
He was brusque. There were whole lots of things about his approach which used to grate with me. But I used to swallow because the importance of change was paramount. And it could be argued in hindsight that perhaps I was too accommodating, that I should have seen him as a greater danger to my own position that was going to ultimately spill over in the way that it in fact did. Perhaps in the end I paid a personal price for the way in which I handle that. But if I look at it in terms of the good of the country, it was probably a price that had to be paid.
The man born to be Prime Minister left the stage with Australia transformed, but he was forced to bow to Keating. No longer was Bob Hawke seen as the Messiah, as he had been when the people swept him to power adoringly 9 years before.
I think Bob Hawke, in my personal opinion, will end up Prime Minister.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I think he's number one.
Well, I think Bob Hawke is the man that they really need in the position, and I sincerely hope that he will be there for many long years to come.
He'd been president of the ACTU, he'd been their industrial advocate, he'd been the one that would be able to settle strikes and industrial disputes in Australia.
They knew where he was coming from. He was straight. What you saw was what you got. He wasn't another plastic, glossy, insincere leader.
There you go.
He was a real Australian, and he had a warm and emotional side as well. And he endeared himself greatly to the Australian population.
It was manna from heaven. It was the elixir of life. Bob really loves adulation, appreciation. He's the embodiment of the Oscar Wildeism. The flatterer is seldom interrupted.
Mr. Hawke, how much credence do you place in public opinion polls?
Well, I suppose they're, like many things in human affairs, they're an indicator. I don't think they can ever be absolutely accurate, but you can't discard them.
How do you react to the fact that this morning's indicates that your popularity has risen beyond all expectations?
That's not a bad public opinion poll.
The wonder of the down underdog, let's all into Bob Hawke.
All right.
I wouldn't have put two bob on him when he was really on the grog to become the Prime Minister of Australia. He was not a pretty sight when he was really on a bender, and that was not an infrequent occurrence.
It really began in earnest when Bob stopped drinking, in earnest. And then I knew that, that his ambition to be Prime Minister and the hopes for many people around him could be materialised then.
It was a really extraordinary change in a man to go off the grog altogether and you know, to start living with the rigours of a Capuchin monk, practically. And he did all that. And that certainly demonstrated the depth of his ambition and his dedication to achieving his goal, which was always to be the Prime Minister of Australia.
To achieve his ambition, Hawke had first to get rid of Labor's leader since 1977, Bill Hayden. That wasn't Hawke's only problem. Another ambitious Labor frontbencher had his eye on the same prize.
Another day, another dollar.
Keating always considered himself Bill Hayden's natural successor. As a result, he was very ambivalent about Bob Hawke's entry into Parliament because he saw Bob as a possible barrier to those ambitions.
Well, I had meetings with him at the request of, in the first case, his colleagues in the ACTU from New South Wales. And I met him. I had not, other than exchanged pleasantries with him before that. I'd never had a meal with him, for instance. I'd never sat down with him. I was then the president of the Labor Party in New South Wales. I think he understood what is an old, at least New South Wales political adage, in Labor Party terms, where goes New South Wales, so goes Australia, that he thought together we could be a great team and that we could beat the coalition, and he wouldn't want to stay around forever. You know, a couple of terms and that'd be the end of it, sort of thing.
It was here at Sydney's Boulevard Hotel that Paul Keating claims a deal was done on the leadership of the Labor Party when he and Hawke met in 1980, 8 years before the celebrated transition arrangements at Kirribilli House.
I think it's fair to say that he proposed that he should lead, he should be given priority in leadership, and the fact he would be there a couple of terms was to give me some interest in seeing him take the leadership before me.
I think at one point I made the observation that about 2 terms that I would hope that in 2 terms we would have done the substantial work of laying the basis of Labor reform. But at no point was there any unequivocal undertaking to Paul or to anyone else, not that anyone else was seeking it, that 2 terms was written and then I would hand over to him.
Hawke and Keating now differ on the details of the 1980 negotiations, but Keating's staff confirm he was absolutely convinced a deal did exist.
Paul certainly had an understanding that if Hawke became Prime Minister, he would step aside for Keating sometime subsequent to that. That was in a period before Bob became Prime Minister. Following that, it seemed to increasingly reach new heights. From the first days of government, Paul always believed he'd be the successor, and as time went by, he believed he'd be the successor probably earlier rather than later.
What he meant was he wasn't staying forever. There'd be something in it for me, and 5 or 6 years would see him out, that sort of thing. Well, I thought that was fine, you know.
Good evening from Hugh Evans, and for Mr Hayden, Mr Hawke, and no doubt for Mr Fraser, this week in politics is turning out to be a very long one indeed.
The critical meeting to establish the numbers for Hawke's push against Hayden happened again at the Boulevard, this time in 1982. In spite of Keating's claim of a deal involving succession, he was the last of Hawke's faction to switch from Hayden.
Leading another life, then dashing in later on in life, in his case in 1980, I did regard as a low entry price, which entitled you to a modest but reasonable run. And I said as much, you know. And the idea that we were saddled with leaders because of their innate glory and capacities forever was not a concept he would try to, I don't think, weary me with.
I think deep down he felt Hawke had a better chance of winning the election, but at the same time he wanted to give Hayden his just rewards, but probably overriding all of that, he was more concerned about what it did to his own personal ambitions to become Prime Minister.
Finally, Keating made the leap. He backed Hawke.
I believe, however, that the New South Wales members will take the view that the best interests of the Labor Party and the millions of Australians who deserve and need a Labor victory and the end of Fraserism will be best served by Bob Hawke now becoming leader.
Here is a news flash from the ABC. There is mounting speculation that the Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, is about to call an early election.
The Labor Party's federal parliamentary executive meets in Brisbane today against a background of mounting speculation about the future of its leader, Mr Hayden.
The Labor Party's parliamentary front bench began arriving here in Brisbane last night.
Could the ACTU work better with Hawke as leader of the ALP than Hayden?
I'm not going to discuss the question of leadership of the ALP. That's a matter for the ALP.
Are you still a strong supporter of Mr Hayden?
I don't answer those questions.
Mr Bowen's actions have put the Labor leadership on the line.
Well, it was a day of extraordinary drama, full of highs and lows and light and shade. We went there in a very acute mood of expectation, anticipation. It was pretty well known by the time we got to the meeting that Bill had made the decision to resign. It was only a matter of that being announced and falling into place.
When I arrived, Bill Hayden said to me, look, I'm going to make the announcement about my resignation at morning tea.
Bill Hayden is upstairs on the 12th floor, apparently conferring with his advisors.
We went upstairs and discussion started about issues that he wanted.
In the despair of the time, he wanted out, and he wanted an undertaking that we would appoint him High Commissioner to London, and we gave him that undertaking. And he wanted immediately the shadow foreign ministry.
The debate between he and I got personal and somewhat acrimonious. I was objecting to the fact that he was taking the foreign affairs policy from me. He wanted undertakings given about his future, which I wouldn't think should have been given.
So these things were discussed in an atmosphere of high drama and emotion.
Whilst we were having that discussion, a knock came to the door. A messenger saying, look, gentlemen, I just been told to tell you that the Prime Minister has gone out to see the Governor-General. And it brought a new atmosphere to the room. We all laughed and said, well, Malcolm really doesn't know what he's about.
So it was a mixture of euphoria and of challenge, because I knew the election was going to be immediately upon us. And I can say sincerely that there was also a feeling of human sadness.
There's so much agony involved in these leadership changes for anyone who's close to them, for anyone who just isn't unequivocally one-eyed, blind supporter of either side. It's always a matter of balance, even for those of us like me, who was as close as I was to Bob and as involved as I was in the business of getting him there. I had a lot of respect and a lot of affection for Hayden, and it was just terribly sad to see, in a sense, the end of that chapter of his career being played out.
Well, today I advised the shadow cabinet of the Labor Party, the Parliamentary Labor Party, that I would be resigning as leader of the opposition.
I will be a candidate for the leadership of the Labor Party, and as I understand at this stage, I would not be opposed.
I believe that a drover's dog could lead the Labor Party to victory, the way the country is and the way the opinion polls are showing up for the Labor Party.
Bill Hayden has done a remarkably courageous thing, an extraordinarily difficult thing to do.
It's not a decision that I would have preferred, In fact, as recently as Sunday, I was still determined to fight the matter out, but it was increasingly clear to me that if I did that, I would be guaranteeing great damage to my own party and a return of the Fraser government at the cost of my own personal interests. And I'm afraid my motivation goes beyond that. So thank you.
This is News Voice, and we take you to Canberra for the Prime Minister's press conference.
I've recommended to His Excellency that there should be a double dissolution of the Parliament. That has been agreed. The election will be on the 5th of March.
Mr Fraser, did you have any second thoughts this afternoon when you found out that you would like to face Mr Hawke and not Mr Hayden?
On the contrary, I had a little more relish. It'll be the first election in which two Labour leaders have been knocked off in one go.
It's a total and absolute sellout to the union movement. And we have a Labour Party.
The basic problem confronting Australia as we went up to the 1983 election is that we had an Australia that was bitterly divided. So reconciliation was the basis of everything. On the basis of reconciliation, we had to have recovery because we were then in a serious recession, high unemployment, double-digit unemployment, double-digit inflation. And out of that, we had to have a reconstruction of the Australian economy. So there it was in 3 R's, reconciliation, recovery, reconstruction.
Well, under Labour, savings would be safer under your bed than it would in the banks.
The man is getting desperate, isn't he?
And it really is a massive confidence trick on the Liberal Party.
The task and the challenge remain the same: to bring Australians together in a united effort until victory is won.
He was the great conciliator, going to bring Australia together, heal the divisions, and introduce consensus into political leadership. And that's the way he campaigned.
Good evening, this is Richard Moorcroft welcoming you to the National Tally Room in Canberra.
We had a hotel suite in Canberra because the tally room in Canberra was where the result would be announced.
Right, but the early figures are in fact favouring the Labour Party.
Before the television had started to show any votes, it was his father's birthday. I remember being very surprised. I was asked would I propose a toast to his father on his birthday. I'd never met his father until that night. And anyhow, we did it. Bob sat in his chair and joined in the, toasting the Dad with his soft drink. But he was a very restrained man. He knew it was his destiny to be Prime Minister. And so he was very calm about everything. I found it a bit eerie, just how calm he was.
Your mind immediately was concentrating upon the enormous challenge and responsibility that you had.
So it was very much a feeling of, this is big deal. This is a big responsibility. This is going to affect us all.
It was explosive there. When Hazel and I walked around the corner, we were seeing that the place did explode. And, well, then, in that context, euphoria was the dominant part.
Waving, looking very pleased and happy, understandably, with the degree of enthusiasm, the enthusiastic applause which he's receiving from the crowd below.
I therefore take total responsibility for the defeat of the government, and I would like to thank all my colleagues and the Liberal Party right around the country for the support they've given, not just over recent weeks, but over the last 7 years.
A lot of us felt the bastard has been beaten, Fraser. At long last, after 7 years in the wilderness, we were hoping for the 7 years of plenitude, of good harvests, as it were. We were aware, seriously aware, of the enormous problems of the economy and the country.
I was determined, if I could, to avoid the pattern of the past where Labor seemed to have just been called in or had been able to scrape in and been a government for a brief period, and then it was dissipated. And so I was determined to try and make this a long-term government.
This was the prize Hawke had always believed would be his. Now his overriding ambition was to keep it.
Paul John Keating, I've approved your appointment as Treasurer.
Keating, the young, inexperienced new Treasurer, shared Hawke's view. This was not going to be a government of disarray, like the previous Labor government of Gough Whitlam, 1972 to 75.
Memories.
They were economically inept to a degree which is almost beyond description. I had said to him specifically that whatever you do in the field of social reform or in the international field will be as nothing, will count for nothing. If the economy's not right, and you'll live or die as a government in the economic field.
It became almost a fad amongst some of the ministers to attack anything that smacked of Whitlamism. And it was one of the many colourful terms of abuse that a minister such as myself might attract when arguing for more money for disadvantaged schools or something of that kind, that you were just an unreconstructed Whitlamite.
This is AM Good Morning. There seem to be few real comparisons with the style and euphoria of the Whitlam Labor government.
On the Sunday following the election, I received a telephone call from, I think, the Prime Minister's then personal assistant, Mrs. Sinclair, asking me if I would go and come and see the Prime Minister. And I said, of course I would.
And that's when I was called out of a celebration for my wife's victory in the election of electorate of Canberra to draft for Stone's signature a paper to Hawke on the fiscal outlook. I was at that stage in charge of fiscal policy and Treasury, and that was the famous $9.6 billion minute that was used by Hawke and Keating later that week.
I mean, it is just unbelievable that what the Australian people and we as the alternative government have been faced with is a proposition of being told that the deficit on existing policies in 83-84 would be $6 billion, when in fact they knew it was $9.6 billion. Now, no responsible incoming government can say, oh, well, there's another $3.6 billion that's been thrown at us, so that doesn't make any difference. Of course it makes a difference.
The massive projected deficit of $9.6 billion was cleverly used by Hawke and Keating to undermine the credibility of the Liberal Party for years to come. They also used it to cut back their own big spending economic policy, trampling over opposition from within the government.
There was very much a move within the party to not be concerned about the $9.6 billion deficit and, if necessary, have $11 billion, $13 billion to satisfy the commitments given during the election campaign.
It's always easy to say, OK, let's spend, and try and spend your way into recovery, but I knew that there were limits to how far you could do that.
Very quickly, I felt that all the work that we'd been doing over the previous 7 years was being discarded, and that no longer was growth of employment going to be the central goal, but cutting the deficit was going to be, the budget deficit was going to be the central goal, and that all sorts of policy initiatives which we'd articulated during the campaign, which had won approval during the election, were not going to be implemented. And it was a shatteringly disillusioning experience.
Well, John was a true believer of the sort of mixed up orthodoxy of the Labor Party of the 50s and 60s. He used to say to me in these sort of simplistic terms, a government can decide the level of growth it wants. You just turn up the wick. You just turn up the fiscal wick.
The bureaucrats of the powerful Treasury leapt in to help Hawke and Keating rewrite Labor's economic policy. They were enthusiastic supporters of slashing government spending. Within weeks, a budget deficit $1 billion less than Fraser's was locked in.
Treasury's always had its own agenda, always will have. The important thing is that Treasury has the discipline to the maximum extent practicable, make that agenda consistent with the agenda of the government of the day. And I think there was much greater preparedness on the part of Treasury to do that than in earlier times with earlier governments. The result was Treasury got infinitely more of its agenda up under the Keating government. It got more of its agenda up in the decade of the Hawke-Keating government than for the rest of the post-war period combined, easily.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Australian Government, I have the greatest pleasure in welcoming all participants and observers to this historic National Economic Summit Conference. We meet here today as the representatives of the Australian people.
The Economic Summit, April 1983, the fulfilment of Hawke's great election theme of bringing Australia together.
I thought the whole notion of consensus was fanciful, and I did use a colourful expression once that if the public wanted spiritualism, they could join the Hare Krishna. I think I said it somewhat more forcibly than that, but the fact is, they were ready for a bit of spiritualism, and it was Hawke's special magic that wove that spiritualism that they embraced.
I have much pleasure on your behalf in calling upon the Honourable Paul Keating, the Treasurer of Australia, to speak to the conference.
Thank you. Our government's principal economic objectives are a resumption of growth and activity and employment and a consequent reduction in unemployment.
The Paul Keating of the Economic Summit was an anxious novice treasurer still finding his feet.
When he became Treasurer, he was terribly apprehensive about being Treasurer.
Our immediate policy efforts must be directed towards securing a recovery with durability.
He did have an overwhelming reliance, more than most ministers, upon the experts. He was a great user of ideas from others.
It took me a while to find my position. I mean, I never was able to conjure the trick of looking beamingly confident when I wasn't. I mean, if I look confident, you know I am confident. Because when I'm not, I can't get the look.
Through most of 1983, it's fair to say that it was Hawke who was running economic policy. Keating didn't really come into the game until in a powerful way until later in the year.
The summit also served the purpose of endorsing the government's accord with the trade union movement. This was one of the cornerstones of economic policy for the next 10 years.
Started to develop the accord out of a sense of concern that when Labor was last in government, that basically we made a bit of a mess of it in terms of industrial relations, and also particularly in terms of the way wage rates related to the economy. I don't think we could look back with any sense of pride that what we wanted was a long-term Labor government. a long-term Labor government with a long-term strategy.
I now call on Bill Kelty, the Secretary of the Australian Council of Trade Unions.
Mr Prime Minister and participants of this conference, what the summit did was to give the Accord a legitimacy, to say this is what the Accord is about. Now, it also forced the unions to come to terms with the process of government very early.
Mr Hawke was elected on a promise of bringing Australians together. Well, after just 5 weeks, there they are. The captains of industry, the union bosses, the politicians, a cross-section of Australian society had spent 4 days grappling with ways to achieve a common goal, get the economy moving. And there were many who considered the conference an unparalleled success.
What we had to do at the summit, amongst other things, was to get an understanding amongst all the participants in the economic and social play that what the economic parameters were, what the realities were, what the limits to government deficits were. I understood, perhaps better than some of our colleagues, that if the world decided that they were going to take a set on Australia in these circumstances, if there was a perception both of this blow in our budget deficit and then no sense of responsibility on the part of the incoming government, then, you know, where were we? No Australian government, even one as well led and as well manned as the Hawke government was in 1983, 84, can simply say that to the world. If the world decides it doesn't trust you, then it can ruin you.
The world's financial markets were initially distrustful of the new Labor government. They had forced a 10% devaluation of the Australian dollar 2 days after Hawke came to power. But by the end of 1983, the market's little machines were spewing out the biggest test the Hawke government was to face. Australia was being flooded with overseas money.
It was the last day of Parliament, which traditionally is almost like school breakup. Nobody's focusing on policy issues, everybody wants to go off and party and have a good time.
On the Thursday night before the decision to float, we'd already had a lot of foreign currency flowing into the country. And our understanding from the various banks and other dealers was that there was a lot more poised to come in from Europe, from the USA and from Japan. We became quite concerned about what the effects of that would be on the domestic economy.
The Reserve Bank had been on the telephone all day saying something had to be done. The big issue that had to be addressed by Keating and the Treasury and the Reserve Bank was not, I believe, whether the currency would be floated or not, it was whether they would allow the markets to open on the Friday.
Eventually, on that Thursday night, December the 8th, 1983, the decision was made. The Reserve Bank was to close the markets. This was to allow two of the most far-reaching decisions in Australia's political and economic history. The float of the dollar so that market forces and not the government set the value of the dollar, and the lifting of exchange controls, enabling Australians to freely invest, lend or borrow abroad. Drastic steps, especially for a Labor government, which caught the markets by surprise.
Estimate is that about $900 billion a day flow around and cross the foreign exchanges of the world. I mean, it would have been an exercise in futility to believe that little Australia, I mean, I say little in terms of the size of its economic clout, could have said to the rest, well, we're going to tell you that this is going to be our exchange rate and you'll just honour that and recognise it and work within the framework that we set down.
Reserve Bank officers rushed to Canberra to take part in the discussions between government leaders and officials in the Cabinet room.
I was sitting where I normally sat at the Prime Minister's chair, at the head of things, Paul Keating was sitting over on the left where he normally sat as treasurer. Stone was sitting along from me, a couple, and you had other Treasury officials along next to Keating, and then you had the Reserve Bank people down at the end side. It was a fascinating discussion.
The Prime Minister tested out with practically everybody in the room what their feeling was on the subject, and the overwhelming view was that we really had no practical alternative but to float the exchange rate.
And I said, well, that's enough. I said, I want you to now go away and deal with the mechanics of it as to how we handle this in terms of announcement, and come back. And that was it. And when they were going off, John Oswald Stone, who was just too along from me, in a rather melodramatic fashion, said to me, Prime Minister, you'll regret this decision.
I can't comment on anything. I mean, something in the cabinet room, I can't comment on that.
You had the strange paradoxes that here was this man who, in political terms, was way out in the Genghis Khan territory of the right, being in the same position as the sceptics or the opponents of the left.
And at the end of it, the Prime Minister, Hawke, said something like this. He said, you know that I have a great affection for the left of my party, and you know that they regard you as Stone as Olga #1. However, it's only a few weeks away from Christmas, and I can't, in all good conscience, take their favourite bogeyman away from them by telling them what you've been saying here today.
I can't comment. Again, I mean, these were things happening, to the extent they were happening in the cabinet room. I can't. A public servant can't comment on what happened in the cabinet room. Ministers may feel able to, or give some version of it.
After it became clear that the currency was going to be floated, irrespective of John's views, John Stone and the Treasury officials with him stood up and left the meeting, basically taking the attitude, on your head be it.
At a news conference this evening, Federal Treasurer Paul Keating announced Cabinet's decision to float the dollar and abolish a major part of existing exchange controls.
The decision to float means that the speculators will now be speculating against themselves rather than against the Australian government via the Reserve Bank.
I think there was a sense of exhilaration about it because many people had plugged away for years pressing the system, pressing us to float, and you know, the great day had arrived.
After the cabinet meeting which decided to float the dollar, a meeting in which I must say I felt not particularly well informed or expert, I came back to Melbourne and I listened to the announcement of the cabinet decision on PM in the car radio. And I must say I nearly freaked out because it seemed to me a huge decision to have made when all the commentators started to talk about it. I didn't realise, I think, the largeness of that decision at the time of the cabinet discussion.
Financial markets and commentators were wildly enthusiastic about the float, so much so that both Hawke and Keating now claim major credit.
The initiative for the float of the dollar came from within my office.
I had pretty well decided that the float was the order of the day about May of 1983.
Paul Keating had to be brought along on it. There was, of course, in Treasury, at the level of the Secretary-Treasurer, a total opposition to the concept. Stone totally opposed it, and this had its impact upon Paul.
I thought it was important that the Secretary of the Treasury be heard, that he come to the Cabinet meeting and be able to put his view. Now, by that stage, Bob's saying, look, we've decided, let's get it over and done with, let's get it over and done with. But this was not mature. This was not wise.
And Hawke slowly began to be persuaded by people. I think Paul Keating was certainly not in the vanguard of this. He was pulled along.
Meanwhile, even opponents of the time have been persuaded of the merit of floating the dollar.
I think those were the most important decisions of an economic kind, that is to say, taken in Australia since the war. And I think I said, and in many ways, the best.
'Cause the Wales is here to help you through. Yeah, the Wales is here to talk with you.
So why don't you come right in? Come on.
So come right in and let the Wales play a part in your life.
The next move to change Australia by opening it to the world was just as big a shock. This was the introduction of foreign banks to add competition to the financial sector.
By early 1984, a number of things had come together to lift Paul Keating's confidence enormously. He believed himself to be more in control of events. He was indeed more in control of events. And that, I think, emboldened him to take additional measures. And one major product in 1984 was the extra bank licences for the foreign banks.
The issue of foreign bank entry was a very difficult one for the Labor Party. At the same time, it was one Keating was determined to succeed with.
It really surprises me that some people in this party think we owe Westpac something, or the ANZ Bank, or the National. That really surprises me. But let me say this to you. Let me say this to you. Let me say this to you about...
The argument came to a head at Labor's July 1984 National Conference. Keating tackled head-on the Labor Party's traditional opposition to the entry of foreign banks.
Keating has never lacked courage. And to change the platform of the Labor Party is an enormously difficult, time-consuming and divisive task. And he's been successful. Now, prior to the Hawke government, to do that was the equivalent of stealing the holy water from the church. There would have been excommunication. I can smell the faggots burning to burn the culprits now. But they got away with it.
When the initial debate arose, it was sort of, well, that'll go away. You couldn't imagine that we'd go on with that. And that simply recounting a few of the givens in our philosophy was enough to drive it off. And it was a bit late in the day when some of us realised, well, we better come to grips with this argument seriously because it isn't going to go away. It has every likelihood of becoming fact. And in that case, the intellectual underpinning has to be addressed rather than simply debating it through party certitudes.
If you want to start talking about equity and fairness, you better start with unemployment. But you can't do it with a sick economy. Banking is the artery of the economy, and we've had hardening of the arteries for too long in this country.
He was very good in then getting people to come to an acceptance of changed positions. He was very good at this. And I knew that the job we had in government was to change the party in many ways, to change the community, to change Australia. And he could harness the forces of Treasury and the people he had around him, as well as his own capacities. He could harness these in a way which was very, very useful and important in what I wanted to achieve.
Today saw a union of the right and centre-left factions, a union which defeated all attempts by the left wing to change the government's basic economic platform.
He was so certain about what he said. He was charming. He was humorous. He was absolutely devastating and derisory of anyone that argued against him.
The government won on foreign banks and on everything else contentious: uranium, the United States bases, and Indonesia's annexation of East Timor.
The result of the government prevailing on those issues at the 1984 conference really meant the almost, not complete, but to a degree, a large annihilation of the left wing of the Labor Party as a voting force at the party's conferences. And it gave the government itself, that's Hawke, Keating and their ministers, a newfound sense of power, probably. And that led to a maintenance of their agenda for change. And there's no doubt about it, whether you like it or not. Hawke and Keating revolutionised the financial and fiscal system.
By now, Hawke and Keating were riding high. The recession was over, jobs were being created, and they were the darlings of the financial markets.
His measures have been bold, brilliant, and above all, brave.
In 1984, Keating was named by Euromoney magazine as, I think technically, Finance Minister of the Year, which became known very quickly as the world's greatest treasurer. Paul was over the moon at this announcement. Paul considered it at the time the greatest accolade ever.
Through 83, 84, the two officers got on extremely well, as did in fact Keating and Hawke. Keating was forever disappearing upstairs and talking to the Prime Minister in his office immediately upstairs from the Treasurer's office in the old Parliament House. And they spent very long hours together and everything worked very nicely.
Black Knight in front, and Black Knight will win the Melbourne Cup.
You goody! I was passionately interested in sport in its many manifestations. Paul essentially has no interest in sport at all. And he had this absolute fascination with Empire clocks, and on a couple of occasions had me over to explain the esoterics of his clocks. And they were handsome objects, but I must say I sort of didn't have intellectual orgasms about them.
I regard a good day off as getting around my pyjamas about 3 in the afternoon, no shave.
The public image was of a successful, durable team. Hawke was leading the way as the most popular political leader in Australian history. His unprecedented approval rating was hovering around 70%. The polls showed that support for the government was far ahead of that for the opposition. Pressure for an election was intense.
All of the polls, not Labor's private research, but all the published polls, had us a mile in front, had him in the preferred Prime Minister stakes 2 miles in front. I mean, it was just obvious that you had to go. So we went.
Today, he gave 53 days' notice of the next election, inviting the electorate to renew the mandate.
There was a sense that in 1984 that we could have increased our majority from, I think it was 25, through into the 40s. Certainly the more you build up in terms of seats, gives you fat at the next election, it gives you resources in which to fight it, deprives the other side of resources.
But hooray for Bob Hawke! Hooray!
The strategy seemed perfect, but failed completely because Hawke's life and his prime ministership were undermined by family tragedy.
You don't cease to be a husband, you don't cease to be a father, and my children and my wife have a right to be protected in this matter. But I trust it will not be necessary.
Hawke's daughter Roslyn had a drug problem. At the birth of her second child, the desperate nature of her heroin addiction became clear to Roslyn's mother. Hazel immediately had to contact the Prime Minister to tell him their daughter was near death.
Bob was very busy at the time, to the point that when I determined that it was time to intervene, I mean really in welfare terms, it was time for intervention. And so I rang Bob from Melbourne. I rang his PPS, his Principal Private Secretary. He made an appointment and said that I wanted to see him as soon as I came from the airport.
I had known that I'd sacrificed my children to a considerable degree in the development of my career. I'd not spent time with them to the extent that one normally would. And so there was this mixture of anguish for her and guilt in regard to myself.
Well, congratulations. How does it feel to be Father of the Year?
Oh, it's an honour. The one who really should have the title is my wife. She has to be father as well as mother most of the time.
I understood the travel, and in fact, I'd quite come to terms with him being necessarily away, but in addition to that was the unnecessary time away, and the time away that could have been spent with the family had he chosen to. But his life took on such an overload, such a spin, such a public persona, which included a lot of socialising and a lot of drinking. It was the distorted Bob that was a big problem, and unfortunately, the children saw, I think, more of the distorted Bob than they saw of the real Bob that I knew was there, and that made me both very sad and very angry. It was like as if he gave so much publicly that it was just what was left that the family got. What was left over, as it were, from the main game. That's how it seemed very often.
Paralysed by guilt, the Messiah of 1983 was almost destroyed.
Like any father, I loved my daughter. I trust her. I remember one night I was thinking about it, and I thought, you know, my God, what's the point of all it? Give it up and then concentrate on the family. But it was something that I thought quite a deal about. But then I tried to put things in perspective and said, well, you've got wider obligations than just your family, and so I thought I'd battle on. A nation in which all can share fairly in the abundance and all the opportunities offered by this great country of ours in the great years now within our grasp.
As the tears for Roslyn fell during Hawke's 1984 campaign speech, the dreams of a landslide victory evaporated. The election campaign was a fiasco.
He had very severe family problems with one of his children, and he is such an emotional character, as we all know, that impacted upon him in a way in which it was like carrying a huge cross on his bare back for every waking moment of every day. And that affected his psyche enormously. He was at times moribund, sad within himself to the point of almost not being in control.
It was only, I think, as the campaign got underway that we realised, those who were close to him, those of us close to him, how much he'd been affected. And again, we, as a group, his office, my office, a couple of us who were ministers, you know, put in a larger effort to, you know, buttress him in the course of the campaign.
Well, we just sort of meandered around Australia about 8 weeks, trying to work out why we're having it and what to do with it once we realised why we're having it. You know? It was not good.
And the nation teeters tonight on the cusp of tedium. The election campaign entered its 400th year, with all parties now on heavy medication and most of the livestock and vehicles already moved to higher ground. The front runners, Tweedledum and Tweedle Even Dumber, are now addressing audiences of beach balls and household appliances in a pitiful attempt to stay awake until December the 1st.
As we've been saying all night, Labour is being threatened in anywhere between 10 and 12 seats. The number down now is down to 9.
We let what was essentially a weak opponent, you know, take votes and seats from us at a time when, given the government's economic success and the vast changes we'd been making, it should have seen for Labor its greatest ever federal victory. That's what was in prospect.
The calling of the 1984 election was a great mistake, probably Hawke's greatest political mistake. He was still a popular figure, but a politician would kill to have that other ingredient in his image, that one of being somewhat above politics. That's a very rare commodity, and Hawke lost it in one fell swoop after calling the '84 election.
It seems Hawke must have known. He and Keating addressed a business function at the Regent Hotel in Sydney during the 1984 campaign. According to Keating, the Prime Minister was not pleased with his Treasurer's performance. It was too good.
I got up and gave an extemporaneous performance. But at that stage, it was not long after the float, not long after deregulation. The economy was picking up. We had a good story to tell, so I told it enthusiastically, colourfully, and got a big reception, big ovation for it. So, but I'd mentioned him, you know, appropriately and graciously on the way through. But as we left, I said, and we walked out the door, and I said, well, it didn't go bad. He said, look, my friend, I'll tell you this. He said, you can have this job, he said, when I'm good and ready to give it to you. He said, and that'll be about, he said, at the earliest, about 1990. And I thought, God, what have I said, you know? What have I done to deserve this sort of rebuke, you know?
Keating claims Hawke was so devastated by his family problems that his leadership barely recovered.
Of course I'm upset.
Hawke rejects this. He acknowledges his performance suffered, but only from August 1984 to mid-1985.
Probably my judgments weren't so good as to what I should do or what I shouldn't do. So my judgment, I think, was impaired, and the vivacity, if you like, with which I did things was significantly diminished.
A leader's job is to nourish his party with ideas, zest, leadership, zing, call it what you like. All that happened in '83 and through '84. What I say is he stopped nourishing us. And you can't be a leader and stop doing that. But he lived to tell the story. But that's Bob. He's a very lucky guy. He always ends up with a group of people who will look after him when he's in strife.
Of course, it was a nonsense that in any sense I stopped being Prime Minister. It may have been that he made a decision then of proceeding to deceive me. That may be so, I don't know. But the fact that I was in a very depressed emotional state because of my daughter, and to go from that and that I showed it, that was when I ceased being Prime Minister, is, I would suggest, a comment not upon me, but upon him.
From this time on, Keating's confidence grew immensely. Increasingly, he would see himself as the one running the country. Soon, he would throw the government into a period of political and economic turmoil that would change Australia forever.